Just to begin with a little bit of context, you have here a picture of Robert Browning. Now, Browning was a Victorian poet, and his poem My Last Duchess was published in 1842. The poem explores events in the past, though. It's loosely based on the story of Alfonso II, Duke of Ferrara, Ferrara being a region in northern Italy. The Duke of Ferrara had 3 wives and no children, and his first wife died very young in very suspicious circumstances. Some historians believe that she was poisoned, and they point the finger at Alfonso. So this dramatic monologue tells that story from Alfonso's point of view. He lived in the 16th century, and you'll see in just a second when I play a reading of the poem that Browning does use archaic language, so we have phrases like "'twas not" and "twill," which reflects the fact that this is a poem set in the past and lends it a certain authenticity.
That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, it was all one. My favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss, or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping. And I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will please you rise. We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me.
In order to talk about structure and form, I've got some key words up here and I thought it would be useful if I just simply talk you through them. So the first key term is dramatic monologue, and that's the form that Browning has used to write this poem. It's written in the form of a dramatic monologue. Now, a dramatic monologue is a poem in which a character presents an account of something, talks about a particular topic. And this single character speaks all of the words in the poem, hence monologue. Mono means one, so we just have one person talking in the poem. In this poem, of course, that character is the Duke of Ferrara, who's talking about his late wife. But actually, and this is typical of the dramatic monologue, what we as listeners are most interested in is what he reveals about himself through the way that he tells his story. So it becomes very clear that we're dealing with a very controlling, arrogant, and immoral man in the Duke of Ferrara. But of course, he doesn't come out and say that. We have to infer that through the way that he tells his story. And this is something we'll look at when we discuss use of language. Moving down the list of key terms, you'll see that the poem's written in iambic pentameter, so we have that familiar 5-beat rhythm, and it's also written in rhyming couplets. Perhaps given the Duke's intensely controlling character, this rigid form is appropriate. He's in a way controlling language with the very firm grip that he controlled his wife, his late wife, or the firm grip with which he attempted to control his late wife. Finally, on form and structure, it's really important to mention the term enjambment. That, as I've said on previous videos, refers to the splitting of a phrase or sentence between lines in a poem, so an idea carries through from one line into the next in an unbroken flow, really. And Browning makes heavy use of this in My Last Duchess. For me, two things result. Firstly, it makes the poem sound much more natural when it's read. You don't really hear the rhyming couplets because there is no pause at the end of each line for the sort of rhyme to be reinforced. And that adds to the poem as a dramatic monologue, makes it sound more natural, more like speech, more like a character really speaking. But I think the enjambment also suggests something of the struggle, perhaps, that the Duke has in totally controlling language. It kind of spills out ideas one line to the next. And again, perhaps this is indicative of the struggle that he felt he had attempting to control his wife within the constraints that he set. The tone for this monologue is set even in its title, My Last Duchess, Ferrara. Notice the pronoun my, and we become very quickly aware that the Duke viewed this woman, my last Duchess, as his personal possession. My last Duchess, phrase a bit like my last car. It was something that he owned, and now he's going to move on and find a new model. Indeed, it's because he's in the market for a new model that he has a visitor, because that is the very thing that they are talking about, the terms of the next marriage. So the tone of the speaker's voice could be described as very arrogant, very domineering, very self-centered. That tone, I think, you pick up immediately, as I say, almost from the title of the poem. But it shifts and darkens this poem because the Duke stops talking just about the painting and begins to reflect on the woman herself. And when he does this, the poem becomes something of a diatribe. He is full of rage, obviously, about the way that she behaved, and that was why he had her silenced. And so it becomes a very sinister poem. He doesn't actually confess to murdering the Duchess, but there is a very strong suggestion that he did, and that's what we as readers infer happened. You could describe the tone of the poem then as dark and chilling. Of course, the poem itself isn't split into sections. As we've said, it's a dramatic monologue, and the words simply pour out of the Duke as he recalls his frustrations regarding his last wife. And you get the sense that you could never get a word in edgeways with this man, who's obviously very used to the sound of his own voice. And the single monologue captures those ideas, I think. But for this analysis, it's obviously going to be helpful to split it into sections. So these first 13 lines of the poem focus on the portrait itself. So the Duke begins by describing it. "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive." So clearly he admires the realism of the painting. "I call that piece a wonder now," he says, which is very troubling because clearly he's talking about his wife when she was alive as a piece as well, as an object, as a possession. She was less wonderful then, though, it seems. She's a wonder now. She's a wonder now that she's dead and reduced merely to the status of being a fresco, a picture on his plaster wall that he can look at and not be troubled by. "Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will't please you sit and look at her?" We get the sense that this isn't a man to be argued with, and I'm sure the visitor has no choice but to sit and admire this portrait as the Duke holds forth. I said Fra Pandolf by design. That means that the Duke deliberately gave the name of the artist because, as he explains in the next lines, anybody who sees the portrait, and in particular the depth of the passion in the woman's glance, wants to know who created it, who was the artist who conveyed that passionate emotion. But the Duke explains they daren't necessarily ask. "To myself they turned, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst," is the line that indicates that. And it also shows the Duke's very strong sense of his own importance and the fact that people think very carefully about anything that they might say to him, particularly in relation to something so intimate as an ex-wife. Notice the brackets in the middle of the quotation that I gave you there. "Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I." That reveals that it's only the Duke himself who's allowed to draw back the curtain and look at this painting. And that reflects perhaps the jealousy which we see as a major theme as the monologue develops. Now, the Duke is able to totally control his ex-wife because she's merely a painting. And now at last, he alone can see her, and if other men do, it's only at his bidding, it's only when he draws back the curtain. One gets the sense that he wishes that were the case when she was alive, because he was very unsettled by the idea that other men might be looking at her then. Now that problem is solved completely, and he can simply draw back the curtain whenever he wants to, and she's completely in his control. This theme of possessive jealousy continues in the next lines. "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." There, he's talking about a spot of joy, perhaps a blush on the Duchess's cheek, which has been recreated in the painting of her, and he's noting that that blush wasn't only for him, 'twas not her husband's presence only. So she blushed with pleasure in front of other people, and we can infer that the Duke is deeply unhappy about that. Notice "spot of joy" is a phrase that is carried across the two lines, so there's a prime example of the enjambment that I talked about earlier. The Duke's clearly most troubled by this idea of his wife daring to blush at anything other than himself, because he continues to ruminate on it and to speculate as to what may have caused the blush in the painting. He says, perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. So there he's quoting what he thinks the artist might have said, and he's speculating that perhaps the artist asked the Duchess to lift her mantle, in other words, her shawl, a little bit, because it covered too much of her lovely wrist. So the artist perhaps asked her to expose a little bit more flesh. We get from this a strong sense of the Duke's paranoid insecurity and jealousy. And as always with monologues, he's revealing much more about himself than he hears about the Duchess. He goes on, paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. This is another thing that he thinks the artist might have said to her. He might have flattered her by suggesting that with paint he can never recreate her real beauty. In the final lines of this section, we get a strong sense of the Duke's enormous ego and his belief that his wife should have been interested in nothing at all but him. She clearly was interested in the world, as he says. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Perhaps pick upon the innuendo at the end there later, but on a surface level, he's just saying here that the Duchess enjoyed the world. She took pleasure out of things that she saw, and one would think that's a quality, but not for the Duke, because he wanted her to focus solely on him and not to be pleased with anything else except for him. Such was the scale of his self-absorption and ego. In these next lines, the Duke regrets the fact that his late wife seemed to appreciate everything equally. Now, clearly, she should have been more excited about anything the Duke gave her or did for her than about anything else in the world, but this wasn't the case, as he explained. Sir, 'twas all one. My favour at her breast. Now that refers to a necklace that he might have bought her. That's the favour, and her breast describes where the necklace hangs. My favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with around the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech or blush at least. So he's saying there that wide range of things, the mule that she rode on, the cherries that somebody gave her, of course that person was a fool in the Duke's eyes, the dropping of the daylight in the west, in other words, the sunset, all of these things he feels delighted her equally, and that has made him angry. You can see accumulating anger in this listing that's going on here, a whole list of things that she liked that she shouldn't have liked, and a sense of growing tempo in the poem now, starting to feel something like a diatribe. But again, we wonder about what evidence he bases this on. At first he says she gave the same approving speech for each of these things, and then he says, or blush, at least. So she didn't necessarily say anything about these things. He just thought that he saw something in her face that indicated deep admiration. So again, his paranoia and jealousy, very evident. His watchfulness feels almost like that of a stalker, doesn't it, in this section? The tone is certainly becoming increasingly sinister. What really seems to irk the Duke is the fact that his wife did not have enough appreciation for the fact that he gifted her with his 900 years old name. In other words, with all of the power and prestige that goes with running things in Ferrara, northern Italy, for nearly 1,000 years. That's his heritage, and hers doesn't compare, and he thinks that she doesn't value that sufficiently, and that's, for him, simply outrageous. He concludes this section, who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? That means that it wasn't worth discussing with her, because to discuss his concerns with her would be to stoop, and it's beneath him to be too troubled by her lack of appreciation. As we see very soon, he's going to deal with that in a very different way than talk about it. So he's not going to lower himself by blaming her, he's simply going to take decisive action. The Duke is being disingenuous at the start of this section. He says, even if you had skill in speech, which I have not. Well, clearly he has. This is a very colourful monologue that he's delivering, full of excellent description. He mimics other people's voices, creates hypothetical situations, asks questions. It's a brilliant piece of oratory, really. So he certainly has skill with speech, and that is not why he didn't choose to talk to his wife about his misgivings. The real reason is at the bottom of this same section, where he says, even then would be more stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Lots of menace in that last statement. To talk to his wife about their marriage, about his displeasure with her, would have been to stoop. She is so far beneath him, he's not prepared to do that. It would be demeaning. Just looking for a second at the middle section as well, he talks there about what he didn't like about her, and he uses the phrase, just this or that in you disgusts me. That's a very strong word, isn't it? Shows just how eaten up he was by his wife's behaviour, which so far we can only gather was blushing at people. He's also concerned that if he lessoned her, in other words, if he tried to teach her a lesson, she might simply try to make an excuse, set her wits against his, and clearly that would be unacceptable. So he's not going to risk having any kind of a negotiation with her. Why would you do that? She's just his possession. She needs to behave, or she needs to be dealt with. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, when I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. Very, very chilling lines, aren't they? She smiled too much. Problem that, for the Duke. All of this smiling and blushing and appreciating things in nature, intolerable for him. Obviously, I'm being ironic there. I think Browning's doing two things. Firstly, he's showing us that this poor woman was actually a very lovely, sweet person who did no wrong and only made people happy, or tried to. But is also showing the sheer madness of the Duke's jealousy. The strong suggestion in these lines is that that madness, that mad jealousy, drove him to murder or to engage an assassin. I gave commands, then all my smiles stopped together. Hear the hissing sibilance in that line there, smiles stopped. Of course, he wouldn't dirty his own hands with this work, so he gave commands. That, for me, is the strong inference. It could be read on a less damaging level, if you like. You could say that, you could interpret this as the Duke commanding his wife not to smile at people anymore, not to be flirtatious, and she stopped that altogether at that point. And then her death might have been entirely unrelated, but somehow the poem doesn't seem to suggest that, does it? In fact, the very next line reinforces the first interpretation. There she stands as if alive. So the notion of her not being alive is being yoked together with the ending of her smiles, with his commands. So perhaps unwittingly, this Duke has disclosed maybe more than he wanted to. So he moves briskly on and suggests that the two of them go downstairs to meet the rest of the company. Would please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. And finally, we discover why this person has visited the Duke. It appears in the next few lines that he has been sent by a count whose daughter the Duke now has designs on. So, alarmingly, another poor woman is soon to be married to the Duke, and even more alarmingly still, she's described as the object of his desire. She's obviously going to be another possession, another object. She's the daughter of a rich count whose munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. That means that the Duke is reassured that he will get a good dowry with this woman, a good amount of money, because the Count, her father, is known for his wealth and for his generosity. That's what munificence means. So this is altogether a good match in the Duke's eyes. It is deeply disturbing for the reader, though, because we know full well that this woman is going to be just like another of his paintings, an ornament, and an ornament that he will doubtless guard just as jealously as he did the last one. These are the last lines of the poem, and the Duke walks past another ornament that he's very fond of. This time it's a statue. It's a statue of Neptune, who is the Roman god of sea in Greek mythology. The Duke proudly boasts that this bronze statue was cast specially for him by one Klaus of Innsbruck. Here's an image of it, and you can see there Neptune taming the seahorse. And clearly that is the way that Duke feels that women should be dealt with. They need to be tamed. They need to be controlled very tightly. Left to their own devices, they're clearly dangerous. Notice the opening phrase of this section. Nay, we'll go together down, sir, or enjambment. But I wanted to suggest to you that the visitor is seeking to get away from this man. He's heard this incredibly sinister monologue and doesn't want to be in the company of the Duke anymore. But the Duke, as ever, is in control and insists that they go down together. He's a powerful man, an aristocrat, and used to having his way in all things. Robert Browning's poem brings to mind this quotation, that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Because we do see in the Duke a man who is corrupt for all his good breeding, his refinement, his superficial manners, his love of art, poetry, the finer things in life. Beneath that is a corrupt and evil individual. This Duke ruled his lands with an iron fist, and he attempts to rule his wife in exactly that way. It's quite possible that he's warning this emissary from the Count, that he's saying that the next woman must be better behaved, otherwise she might meet the same fate. It's interesting that he points out that sculpture of Neptune, isn't it, in a show perhaps of his godlike power. It's got to be significant that the poem ends with that image. So this is a portrait of an abusive, controlling husband, but also one who is insane, I think we'd have to conclude. Browning seems to be exploring the psychology of a psychopath, really, in this poem. A man obsessed with power and control, and who will commit murder in order to assert that control. We've already established then that this monologue is written from the point of view of the despicable Duke of Ferrara, who reveals himself to us in all his ugliness through the way that he talks about the behaviour of his late wife.